Are you a confident writer? Do you even think about your writing, or does it happen so automatically these days? These are interesting questions to me because we spend so much time thinking about writing in school, but then everything changes when we get to the workplace. We're no longer writing to be graded, but writing as part of a relationship. This shift can be challenging, and for those who aren't confident writers, can create a lot of self-doubt. This week, I talked with Erin Lebacqz, an expert in business writing, about how we can all become more confident, effective writers in the workplace. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Erin. So great to meet you, and I'm very excited to talk with you today. I'd love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks, Kim. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I've been teaching since the late 90s. I've taught writing the whole time because I saw how that topic is empowering for others when we build that skill. And over the course of that time, I started with a little high school and then mainly taught university writing, a little bit around the world, but mostly in the US, and then switched over to teaching in businesses. And it's been intriguing because the whole time I've kind of observed, people don't feel super confident about their writing. We are all very nervous, but people want to feel confident, and we can get more opportunities when we do. And so that's why I created the high value writing program, to help people just realize, we can be independent and confident about our writing. We can analyze the situation and make good decisions. We don't have to have gone to a fancy school or been born with this huge writing talent. We can do it through logic, and we can all do it. And that's what my business is about now, helping people be clear and confident and also connect with others through written communication.
So I think this is such a great service because I think we take for granted sometimes that everyone has the same writing background or has the same experience, and that's not true. And I am imagining that there are lots of different kinds of confidence issues that come up when it comes to writing, whether it's I'm not a native English speaker, or, this is not something I feel comfortable doing, and I'm worried that people are going to judge me for it. So I'm curious, you mentioned doing this for business. Do people come to you on their own, or do you offer this as a course within a business and then people come from there? Like, how do people find you, I guess, is the question I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, thanks. It's a mix. Sometimes I work with people one-on-one, often someone who's kind of new to a high level of leadership and feeling nervous, like, oh my gosh, everyone's going to see my writing now. And I'm also representing my business and also trying to motivate and lead my team through my words. It's kind of daunting at first. But more commonly, I'll present in a leadership development program or for an all hands learning session or at a conference, just events about how can we bring emotional intelligence to our writing, because there is another human being that we're writing to, and we don't want to lose that moment to build trust and build a positive relationship, because our words could be making people feel different ways, right? So yeah, it's a little bit of one-on-one, but more often either sort of speeches and presentations like interactive learning or workshops for a particular business.
So what would you say are the key challenges, or what makes it hard for people to write?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because it's just really interesting, isn't it, that we're all kind of nervous about this, and yet it's not talked about very often. I often compare it to something like other daily skills like cooking, or fixing something around the house. We often need to cook or manage a house every day. And so we go, ooh, let me look on a blog and get a recipe. And it's out in the open. But with writing, we're all kind of secretly nervous, and we all do it each day, but we don't really have those opportunities to just talk about it honestly. And I think the main challenge comes from the fact that as we learn writing growing up, there's a lot of mythology around it, such as you have to write in one certain way to look smart, or you have to write in one certain way to be good, or a good student, or a good employee. And that is not true at all. We should always adapt our writing to the given situation. And so each of us are experts in our own situations. And by thinking about them, we can figure out what to do in our writing. But most people feel really nervous because we all got brought up writing for one reason, which was to show that we were good. Like, hey, look at my paper. I know vocab words. I know how to cite my sources. I'm so good. I've proven myself and I've been judged, right? But that's just writing in school. But because we only talk about writing at that time in our life, I think we don't realize later, hey, actually, my writing is quite different now. And it's not really that level of a judgy situation. But we haven't been told, well, how now should I write? I no longer want to write like an essay, like when I was in school, but how should I write instead at work now? And we don't really tell people that it's going to be different. And so they come into the career place and try their best. And as we all go forward, we're just trying to sound good and be it not too bureaucratic sounding, but not too casual. And it can feel like quite a mystery or a moving target for folks.
That is so fascinating, because I had never thought about it that way. But when we are writing growing up, we're writing to be judged. And so it's only natural that that would stick with you as you move through your life. And if there isn't a conscious message that says writing has changed, right? We are programmed to think about it in very limited, very anxiety-provoking ways. I'm curious if you have, and I know this is a really difficult or very open-ended question, but what's good writing?
Yeah, I think good writing is writing that is usable by your reader. Note I say not just readable, but usable. Another difference, we grew up writing to show what we know. Now we're writing for someone to use what we wrote. Maybe we are just telling them something sometimes, but often the reader needs to act upon whatever we wrote, or at least kind of understand it or reply. And so I think good writing is writing that a reader can open up the email or whatever and say, oh, look, it's something that totally works for me. This is so easy to understand and use.
And one thing that always stands out to me around email, and we hear this all the time, is you can't read tone, right? So when you're writing in as your primary form of communication within a workplace, you really piqued my interest when you talked about emotional intelligence in writing, because people have different styles. And sometimes someone's just really busy and they write a one-word answer or one sentence answer. And then everybody thinks, oh my gosh, they're mad at me, or they're so rude, or, we draw so many conclusions from other people's writing that it's not just the writing. It's almost feels like the experience of the relationship that comes through that.
Right. Definitely. I think that's exactly it. I'm glad you put it that way, because we've got our writer and we've got our reader. They both need to bring a little bit of emotional intelligence to the situation, because their relationship is at stake. You're absolutely right. And the writer has to kind of think, okay, with my writing EQ, how can I phrase things in a way that I expect will be interpreted as I hoped, that I hope my tone will come through. And we can do that through things like intentional verb choice. Verbs are often where tone comes through. Also, hierarchy and power come through in verbs. So for example, a leader who's holding a brown bag lunch could say, please join me at the brown bag Thursday, or they could say, please attend the brown bag Thursday. And if my supervisor said, please join me or please attend, I would have a different reaction. I would maybe feel like joining sounds kind of fun and like they want the full me. Attending, I might think, well, I don't know, do I just put my name on a list or what? So one of the idea, from that writer's EQ point of view, we can think, all right, how is this going to be probably digested or sound on the other side? And then for a reader EQ, like you were saying, we can sometimes feel, it's very easy to feel hurt or defensive from an email. but we do want to assume benevolent intent, at least at first, when we're getting to know someone. For example, I had a sort of liaison somewhere I would teach a lot, and she would always include my first name in her email sentences in a way that I thought sounded a little condescending. Like, that'll be fine, comma, Erin. And I go, ooh, am I in trouble? But then I realized, well, she probably is trying to be relational by using my name. I bet she doesn't mean to be condescending. And so we have to, on both sides, try to think what might be the intention. But certainly as writers, that's where we have the opportunity to think, okay, who is this person? How are they going to react to this information? And how can I craft this message so that it's respectful of them and their needs and where they're at in their own lives and their own projects?
And what you're making me think of is that there's work that goes into writing, right? And not to create a sense, not to encourage people to overthink, because I know that that can also become a problem, but that intentionality is important. And I think that that's maybe something that we don't always think about, because we're quickly running through our emails, trying to get our inboxes cleaned up, trying to meet deadlines that we're not necessarily giving it the level of attention that it deserves, given the stakes that are involved.
Yeah, that's exactly, I use the same exact word, intention. People say, what's high value writing? And I say, well, it's writing with meaning and intention, as opposed to just writing with words, right? Which again, we're just taught, hey, put some words on there, as long as they're grammatically correct and you met my word count and you used fancy vocab, you're good to go. But at this point, the intention should be about the relationship with that other person. And also, you were mentioning, Kim, the idea that all this work goes into our writing. And it's so true. And the other truth is that if we as writers don't do that work ahead, when we send the email to the reader, guess who's going to do it? The reader. Or maybe they're not. Maybe they'll say, you know what, it's too hard to fight my way through this email, never mind. Or we're forcing them to do the work of finding, oh, maybe I'm the reader and I think, well, I want to know how soon this is. Well, I want to know what I need to do. Well, I want to know if I can invite someone. If they have to hunt to find that information, then we've left the work for them, which is not really the best way to manage a relationship and build trust, right? We have to do the work ourselves, just like we would in an important conversation with someone, where we would try to bring our best self and manage any kind of like difficulties we may have as a person while we're talking to them.
Well, and I also am thinking about how important it is for managers when communicating with their employees, especially now that so many workplaces are hybrid or virtual, that so much communication does happen in writing. And, you know, I think about this from the perspective of the employee too, of, I don't necessarily feel comfortable asking questions, or I may have self-doubt and I start to think, well, I should know the answer to this. Or if I ask this question, then I'm going to out myself as not being competent enough. When in actuality, as you're describing, the person writing the message didn't make the effort to actually answer the questions. And so it creates not just a disconnect in the communication, but also a sense of fear, or undermines the trust.
Totally agree. I mean, that scenario you described, I would be so nervous as that direct report. I'd be especially because maybe in the old days when we'd see each other at work, I could casually say, hey, when was that meeting again? Out loud, and not feel like they're going to think that I'm dumb or whatever. But when we write, it just feels so serious that we think, oh my God, am I really outing myself? And it's going to go down in posterity. So yes, I think the managers, this is why I love talking with leadership development groups and emerging leaders. That's our opportunity. You know, I've noticed some learning teams or teams in general will spend a lot of money on culture, right? On trying to have a welcoming, inclusive culture, which is super important. But then they'll turn around and send out a condescending all hands email, and that the culture's gone right there in one fell swoop. And so, yeah, managers have the opportunity to write in a way that builds community, that reduces alienation, and that takes out some hierarchy too, so that people can feel more comfortable in their work team, even when they're far apart. And I think on that note, you know, we also want to consider many of our employees now, many of our team members are really young. I have a couple of different friends who've told me that their 20-year-old children have their first career jobs, or maybe 22, like right after college even, and they're at home, in their very first career job, having no idea how to behave, right? Because we all learned by being there when we started our careers, and they don't know. And they're just sitting at home feeling nervous and lonely. And so that's the opportunity for the managers to help bring them in through intentional writing, since that's often the way that they'll communicate with each other.
So I keep coming back in my mind to this idea that there's a lot at stake. How do you convey that without putting too much pressure on people? How do you find the right balance to say, this is important, but I don't want to fuel your anxiety about yourself?
I know, right? Yeah, it's kind of a toughie sometimes. And I will say one thing about my work is that I often don't have to convince people that it matters, because especially since COVID, all of a sudden everybody thinks, oh my gosh, my writing is the new speaking, right? And they're kind of like, I need to look at this. But it is true. Some people maybe don't realize the emotional impact that writing can have, as well as the informational impact, and may not realize what's at stake. So usually I'll try to create a scenario where we all feel what a reader would feel in response to certain sentences. Like I could say in a class, hey, if somebody needed to be redirected, and I would never, use a student name. I usually use myself, but I would say something like, Erin, your report did not provide the information I needed. And then it's kind of like, we all feel like, I tried on my report. And then we feel that emotional response and we think, okay, well, how could this be phrased differently? Like, Erin, I'm looking for X and Y. Can you let me know where it is in the report? Is there some way we could phrase this where the person doesn't feel targeted? And then everyone in the room, we feel, oh my gosh, when I feel targeted, I immediately start getting defensive and I feel disrespected. Like, hey, I tried on the report. Do you want to talk about the good things that I did or just that one bad thing, right? So we really have to phrase, and the example with that example is working with how we use the word you. We have to be very careful in any negative situation about using you or your. And so there are sort of strategies we can use to make sure that we take the emotional heat out of even negative writing, and make sure that we talk about, in that example, the matter at hand, which I think in my example was a report. And we wouldn't need to say, Erin, your report is wonky, or you messed up in this report. All we have to talk about is the report. We don't have to say you or me at all. Let's just talk about, oh, look, page 7 needs more evidence. It's not about you or me, it's about the report. And so we can do a lot of things through intention in that way to make sure we're not accidentally making people feel unincluded or overly criticized, et cetera.
That's such a great point, because we are so sensitive to that type of language, especially if we already feel somewhat I'm trying to think of the right way to say this, but if we don't feel as entirely connected to our workplace, either because we feel different from people around us, or maybe we are in a brand new job where we don't know how much we can trust the people around us. We're going to be reading into every communication that we get, and that's going to lead to a lot of over analysis.
Yeah, a lot of time spent stressing, definitely.
Yeah. Is there I guess I'm wondering if we sort of break this down into things for people to think about, is there pre-work you would recommend? Like, are there things that I should think about before I even start formulating the message?
Definitely. Yeah. I think most of our work in writing should be thinking, not writing itself. And this is why whenever people tell me that they don't, often people will say, well, I'm not a good writer. That'll be a quote that I hear often. And it's kind of like, well, I bet, someone may have told you that, or you may feel like that because of a comment on your paper, but we can all be good writers, because writing is really about thinking. And, it's not about just sitting there and then magic happening and it comes out of our hands on the computer so perfectly. It's more about what you were mentioning, Kim, is the pre-work. And so again, like I mentioned earlier, there is no one correct way to write, but we can figure out how to write by looking at two things, which is who will be reading this and what is my goal. And when we look at who will be reading this, maybe I'm writing, Kim and I are a great example. This is our first time talking out loud or seeing each other on a video or anything like that. We've built this relationship through writing so far. We both felt respectful and excited for the episode. And so the pre-work would be, well, I want to think about Kim. Who is she? Okay, she has a podcast about imposter syndrome and learning. Obviously, these are values of hers for people to be authentically themselves and confident. So I'm already realizing what's important to Kim. And then I can even think, well, what's important to her in this email right now? All right, let me make sure I say that early. Don't wait till the end for the very thing she's looking for. And so most of the decisions I need to make can be made by thinking about trying to get into Kim's shoes. And then the other question being, what is my goal? I can then think, all right, is my goal, what's my informational goal? Is it to say, oh, hey, I'd love to talk with you on October 17th? That's a goal. We always have an informational goal, but we usually have a relational goal too, which is to maybe show that we're trustworthy or to show that we want to collaborate on the particular topic, or to show that we've thought about the other person's realities, even as we ask for resources or whatever it is. And so those two questions are the pre-work. And when it comes time to write, we've actually thought, okay, here's this human being. I want them to, or I'm hoping that they will sign up for one of my classes, feel totally excited, and, trust me for a future project. All of that has to go into how I create that message. But again, we grew up more thinking about correct and incorrect, which really has very little to do with how we write now. We all have spell check. And of course, grammar, we do have to think about it often. But really, the relationship is what the writing is about today. And so it's all about shifting perspective into the shoes of the other person a little more.
I wonder what you think about as the extension of the training, because I think about this myself too, as somebody who will often come into an organization and do, maybe one session, maybe a few. How do they continue to build the momentum and when you're not there anymore? What is it that they can do to continue to develop this skill without you?
Right. Yeah. I'll answer that generally, and then also a little more specifically when it's my class. But in general, I encourage, in fact, last Wednesday, I taught the first half of a session that the other half will be this Wednesday, which is really fun when it's two sessions because there's time in between. And what I ask them to do with their time is the same thing I would say as an answer, which is to observe the emails that you receive and observe your reactions as a reader. For example, did you receive an email that you didn't even have to open because the subject line was so clear that you already knew, hey, I better set aside 10 minutes later to take care of this thing they want me to do? What kind of subject lines make your life easy as a reader? When you open the email, do you feel like it's friendly, or do you feel like you don't want to read it? Do you get a wall of text, or do you get something pretty like headings and bullets and something that you can easily scan? And you are the expert, because we are all readers. So we're all the expert of what works for a reader. So as long as we stay in that perception as we receive people's communications, we can continue learning by observing what does or doesn't work for a reader. I used to worry about that a lot more. That I do have a YouTube channel now, so it makes it a little easier with the YouTube channel and the book, which is I wrote for my students, because same thing, they would say, well, thank you, this was great, but how can I practice? So now I have, two places to send people. But the truth is we can practice on our own since we have the expertise of being a reader.
That's such a great point. And I don't think it's something that we necessarily consciously think about, at least not regularly, because we are so busy and we're pulled in so many different directions. But to raise your consciousness enough to really think about my own emotional response to the emails that I'm getting can help guide how I think about how I deliver the message
right
to my readers. I think that's a really great way to just change your thinking or create more awareness around it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of a lucky situation because we're all worried about writing well, but we all have a free and constant insight into the situation, because even if you're not reading that many emails today, you might be reading texts or posts on social media. These are all opportunities to see, oh, look how that made me feel excited, but that one made me feel kind of annoyed or offended or whatever. Yeah.
That's true. And I think about writing as its own form of communication, but I also think of it as great, for lack of a better term, practice ground for verbal communication too, because it does allow for editing in a way that when we're in the moment, we don't necessarily have the ability to do. And so I wonder if you think about that too, of just, if you are conscious enough about how you're writing, it's likely to influence how you're showing up even in real-time communication with other people too.
I think definitely an example that I've seen is people who've worked hard to make their writing not sound accusatory or blamey are able to take the skills into speech. For example, if we're all in a meeting and the coffee all ran out and burned up because I left it on, we could say, well, Erin left on the empty coffee pot and now it's messed up. Or we could say the empty coffee pot was left on. We have a choice whether to blame Erin or not. When I said Erin left it on, that was active voice. When I said it was left on, that was passive. And I've noticed some people are becoming very skilled at being not blamey in their writing and saying something like, we don't have all the numbers yet, when we have them, instead of saying, well, until Erin sends her numbers or whatever. And then I noticed people doing that in sort of real life verbal exchanges too. And we can even do that at home. Like, oh, did the dog get walked? Did the dishes get done? Like, we don't have to call out the other person of whether they did it. And so I'll see those skills translate a little. Yeah.
That's a good point too, about the transferability to our personal lives.
Definitely.
Is there anything that you encounter that's particularly challenging? And I'm cognizant of the fact that we're talking about not sort of blaming people, but I'm wondering, are there certain, personality types or certain things that just make it more difficult to adopt some of these practices, or anything that is worth emphasizing or thinking about differently?
Yeah, I think with that question in particular, and I'm still sort of learning about this, so I'll tell you what I've noticed so far. I think personality has a lot to do with both writing and reading, but especially reading, because I think our personality impacts how we like to receive and use information. For example, some people like to get all the details of a given plan. We're going to have the presentation at 2:00. We're going to follow it up with notes. Then we're going to send everybody a book. Then we're going to have some online follow-up session. And for me, I happen to have a personality where I like getting a bunch of information and then trying to sort it and remember it. A lot of people do not like that. A lot of people would say, okay, let's talk about the presentation at 2:00, but I don't need to know the next 2 weeks of information right now. I could know that later. And so as a writer, we want to manage how much information do we share at a given time. And I had a recent talk. It's an interview up on my channel with a personality expert. And the one tidbit we kind of unearthed is that, in her opinion, and all listeners, we can see if this is true with ourselves. She said introverts tend to want detail, context, foundational, historic background. And they're okay with like, hey, here's a bunch of information about the whole process. And then she said extroverts prefer to have information that's about what they or their team are going to do now. Practical, applied to the moment, and there's no need to overburden and confuse the situation with more paragraphs about the future. I totally understand both of those points of view. And when I've brought it up in classes, people are mostly saying like, yeah, I'm kind of introverted and I tend to be an explainer in my emails, or I tend to want explanation. And so I would say for all of us, just kind of gauge, do you feel like you're an over explainer or an under explainer? Do you want all the information? Maybe you're an introvert and you want all the detail. That's great. But check if your reader is the same way as you before you send it all to them. And extroverts, you might be thinking, just tell me what's important for my team's meeting today. Well, what if the person you're writing to is someone who likes foundational background? So that's one of the biggies, is literally just how much should I say? How much detail should I give versus manage myself and hold back the detail like I personally have to do, and not overdo the detail for what some readers would want.
So what about when you're writing to multiple readers at the same time? So you've got a distribution list of people who maybe are, composed of a variety of different personality types. Do you pick one, or how do you navigate that?
Hard, right? Yeah. And most of us write to either groups or even just we write to 2 colleagues and CC 2 supervisors or whatever. We're dealing with a lot of interests at once. In these scenarios, I recommend that we lead with what we think everyone would want, which is usually the bottom line. All personality types do need to know the main point of the message. And we all want the bottom line. What's happening? What is this for? So we can start with what everyone would need and have your first paragraph be like the main point, the call to action if there is one. And then you can say, for background and examples, see below. And then have your next paragraph have a nice little heading, historical background or context or whatever. And then a bunch of information there for how did this even come about? Because there are people on your list who want that, and there are plenty who don't. And then you could even have another heading of examples and talk about that. Point being, start with what we all want and then give options / resources. That can also include hyperlinks for people who want more. But don't start with the details that only some people want. Start with what we all want as much as you can, which is usually the main point.
That makes perfect sense. And that brings me to a question about niceties, because there's people in the workplace that are just bottom line for me, right? All business. I don't have time to talk about my weekend. I don't want to hear about yours. How important is it to include that kind of language of hope you're doing well, right?
Right. I mean, I think as in everything, I always tell people in workshops that I have an annoying answer for so many questions, which is it depends on the situation, but it depends on the relationship. So it depends. I do that. Well, also it depends on who we are and what's authentic. So we've got a mix. I need to show up authentically, and I need to show up in a way that works for my reader. So for me, authentically, naturally, I do want to say those things. So I do say, I hope you're having a good week or whatever. But if I know that person really isn't into that, I won't do it. So as I get to know the person, I'll adjust my defaults to what's better for them. I think when we don't know somebody or it's a new relationship, we would want to err on the side of being slightly more formal and also including more friendly things, because we don't know them yet. We don't know how friendly they prefer to be in an email. So we want to have the formality and respect, but also, I hope you had a nice weekend. Or we can try to mirror what we see from them. This happens to me a lot because I come out of education and I come out of California, and those are 2 distinct cultures. And then I'll work with people who come out of finance and New Hampshire, and those are 2 distinct cultures, and they're very different than mine. And so I realize, okay, I might be a little overly friendly, right? For this scenario, I might be a little under formal for this scenario. I might need to be the one to adjust. Or I'll just observe the emails I get from them. What seems to be copacetic? Are we all being very friendly, or are we all really keeping each other at a distance? So we can kind of observe as we read to try to learn about that too.
I think mirroring and what you're talking about is a great idea, because that's really how you get the best insight into what people want, is to try to pay attention to what they're doing and then mirror that back to them. Is there anything that you think about, and I know obviously we're trying to squeeze a lot into a short time, but anything that you think about a lot that we haven't talked about yet that you think is important to include in this conversation?
I think one more thing we could all consider about our reader, usually, and I'll just go with emails since that's the most common still workplace communication, I think. Usually when we get an email, and you can test this with yourself, we're thinking, what is this for? And do I have to do something? Why am I getting this? What is this all about? And do I have a role? So it would be nice. It's kind for us as writers to put that information in paragraph 1 for our readers, because they are probably wondering, what is this for? What should I start getting prepared for, either emotionally or practically speaking? And so don't bury the lead. Don't bury your call to action. Keep that stuff available for your readers really early.
That's a great point. This has been such a great conversation, Erin. How can people find you if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, I'd love to connect with folks. I'm on LinkedIn, and I some options that you all have for learning more about writing. My YouTube channel is High Value Writing, and there's a new video each week. If you subscribe, you'll always get them. Obviously, that's all free. Then I have a book called High Value Writing. That's out on Amazon, etc. So that's a good way to learn. And then actually today I'm premiering a show. It's going to be at 4 p.m. Pacific time every Monday on Win-Win Women TV, where I talk about writing. And so people can hop on LinkedIn. I've put the link up and everything like that. So get in touch or come to my website, highvaluewriting.com, so you can get on the list and I can keep you posted about that kind of thing. But yeah, I'd love to talk with folks and connect that way.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This has been great, Erin.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.